James Hohmann's daily 202 newsletter, which I'm sure all of you subscribe to, is the go-to source for sharp analysis of politics and power in Washington. And this live event series for us presents a unique opportunity to really bring the big Washington ideas to the stage through in-depth interviews with the newsmakers who are driving these policies across the country. And we're excited to continue the series today with Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, who leads the administration's policies on business, trade, entrepreneurship. Before we begin, I do want to thank our presenting sponsor for this series, Bank of America, and introduce to you John Collingwood. He is their Director of Federal Government Relations. He's going to say a few words.
Thanks. Thanks, Chris. Thanks. First and foremost, as I'm sure is the case with everybody here, our thoughts and prayers are with those who are devastated by the hurricanes and all of those who are pitching in to help as well. Our hats, we're stepping up at Bank of America, and our hats off to every other company that's doing the same. It's a huge collective effort, and we're glad that we can be a part of that. For today, I think, as you've heard us all say before, we're honored to help foster the public dialogue that Chris was just talking about. It's hard to imagine a more pressing time to have these discussions given all that's going on both here and around the globe. And of course, what better place to do it than the storied Washington Post that we're in today. Just a little side note, if I could, Secretary Ross and Commerce have a million things going on, all of them of great magnitude. You'll hear about a lot of them today. Maybe not as widely recognized as some would like, but near and dear to our hearts at Bank of America is what Commerce does to foster the vitality of small businesses, particularly minority-owned small businesses. It's a critical plank in our growth responsible growth strategy as well. And it's certainly one of the ways that we and other banks, community banks, banks of all sizes, help communities, local communities prosper. So whether it is here in DC or whether it is businesses like a small corner bakery in Weehawken, New Jersey that we help capitalize, they're all important to us. So with that, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much, John. I'd now like to welcome James Hohmann and Secretary Ross to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it. Good morning. It's great to be here at the Washington Post, and to everyone watching on the live stream. I'd like to thank Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross for joining us as we kick off our fall schedule of the Daily 202 Live interview series. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone in our audience that you can tweet some questions for Secretary Ross using the hashtag 202Live, and I'll work a few of those in throughout our discussion here. There's a lot going on. You're at the center of a lot of things that are happening, and we kind of have a lot to cover. The kind of the big ticket stuff like trade and taxes I want to get into, but there's also been a lot of news this week. I want to start with the hurricane, obviously, Hurricane Irma that's bearing down on Florida. People may not know this, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is the parent of the National Weather Service, is part of your department. Are there enough resources for the agencies on your watch to be able to effectively do what they need to do? And what are preparations like? Are things kind of under control as the hurricane prepares to make landfall in Florida?
Well, first of all, I'm very proud of NOAA. NOAA has the hurricane hunters, these fellows who go in planes right to the eye of the hurricane. And in fact, I was invited to do that today, but I had to do this instead.
We're grateful you're here. It's probably a little bit safer here.
You gave me good cover. But also, they had correctly forecast that this would be a well above average problem year for hurricanes. And unfortunately, while I'd like accuracy, that forecast turning out to be a little too accurate.
Right.
So they are a key part. But President Trump got out in front of this 10 days before Harvey hit Houston. We were meeting, getting everything organized to do it. And I think so far it's been executed quite well. And I can't help but believe that part of the reason was his foresight and getting things organized well in advance, figuring out how the interfaces between the different agencies, the National Guard, Homeland Security, and everyone else. That's a daunting challenge, and it's going to be really tested now because you still have the remnants of Harvey, and we're now into Irma.
Yeah. Some scientists expressed concern about the proposed NOAA cuts earlier in the budget. I know they're for some long-term modeling things. Are you rethinking those at all in the wake of these hurricanes? Like you mentioned, they were right in forecasting. They're pretty accurate, but is that something that's being rethought at all?
Well, as you know, the whole budget process is a fairly complicated thing, both from a political point of view and from an arithmetic point of view. So we'll have to see what comes out of it.
Yeah.
But certainly it demonstrated the need for understanding weather, for being able to forecast it. If only we could figure out a way to control it, then we would really be in good shape.
Then it would be worth spending the money.
Yeah.
The other big news this week, the debt ceiling hike, it's going to end up passing soon. The president struck a deal with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. It's gotten some criticism from Republicans. When President Trump nominated you, he called you one of the best negotiators he's ever met. So from your perspective, was it a good deal that they kind of reached to extend the debt ceiling for 3 months?
Well, we'll know in retrospect for sure. I think the president's point was he wanted to get on over these hurdles, these sort of procedural hurdles, and onto the real event, which is the tax reform and the big ticket items. Because in the month of September, I think the Congress together is only in session 12 days. One house is in 17, one is in only 12. That's not a lot of time to get big things done. So I think what was good about the deal is he's getting things moving.
Mm-hmm. There was talk we heard yesterday, and the president confirmed it, about kind of a gentleman's agreement to get rid of the debt ceiling altogether. You've been in the business world. How valuable would that be to remove uncertainty? Do you think that's something that could actually happen? Would it be good for the markets?
Well, the markets and business people in general hate uncertainty. You can deal with bad news, you can certainly deal with good news, but uncertainty makes it hard to plan, makes it hard to figure out what to do. So in general, I would trade off certainty for uncertainty anytime.
The other big news this week was on immigration. The president announced plans to end DACA, but giving Congress 6 months to kind of come up with a solution. The U.S. Chamber opposed that decision. The White House sort of framed it as they were announcing the move as a good economic policy decision, because they were saying that some of these young undocumented immigrants are taking jobs away from African American and young Hispanic Americans. How much of this is sort of an economic matter and of value versus kind of a political matter?
Well, it's all of the above. DACA was never meant to be a permanent thing. And President Obama, when he put it in after having said publicly and repeatedly that he didn't have the lawful power to do it. So one of the purposes of what the President Trump just did is to make it legitimate. Yeah. It'll be legitimatized by whatever it is that Congress passes. And I think that's good. I think we should have respect for the law. We are a nation that has the rule of law, and I think we ought to abide by it, even on highly charged emotional issues like DACA.
In the last Republican administration, your predecessor, Carlos Gutierrez, was sort of the Bush administration's point man in negotiating with Capitol Hill on immigration. Obviously, he had a unique background there. Do you expect to be involved in some of these conversations and working with Democrats and others to come up with solutions that might kind of give some of these people security or safety protection?
Well, I think there will be some security and safety protection enacted for them. Exactly what form it'll take is a little bit hard to judge at this early stage, but it is an issue that has to be dealt with, and it's an issue that should be dealt with based on the real facts. Real fact is that most of these folks are about 23 years of age on average. This is not a bunch of little children out there. There are some youths, but for the most part, they're adults, and that's a little different configuration. Not that we shouldn't deal appropriately with the adults, we should. and I think we will.
Let's talk about business community relations. You obviously had an incredibly successful background in the private sector over time. Over the last few weeks, we saw some of the business councils dissolve, some of the CEOs withdraw. You have a lot of relationships with some of these folks. Kind of tying it to what we were just talking about, CEOs have become a lot more vocal about a lot of different social causes, including DACA, Paris, Climate Accord, transgender issues, et cetera. When publicly it seems like these relationships are strained, how is that impacting your day-to-day work, if at all? And obviously these businesses want things from government, and there's a lot you can do to help them. What's that dynamic like?
In general, business community morale is really good.
Yeah.
The regulatory reliefs that have been granted by this administration have been extremely well received. And the tax reform is something that they all view, and I agree, needs to be dealt with and needs to be dealt with urgently. We get tax reform through, make the taxes lower, get the money brought back from offshore, make U.S. rates for businesses competitive so that companies don't have to be driven offshore. You know, our tax rates have been almost twice those of many other countries. There's no reason to burden American industry like that. So we want to make America a destination for people, not a place where they have to flee to go to some tax haven.
Totally, and I want to talk at length about tax reform. But so, I mean, is it fair to kind of say that maybe the conventional wisdom or the media coverage about the relations between the administration and the business community is over-torqued, that it's better than it looks on the surface, that maybe CEOs are tweeting things, but in reality they're still kind of working behind the scenes?
Remember, most of these people in the business community, including on those councils, didn't vote for the president to begin with.
Right.
They were mostly supporters of the other candidate. So it isn't as though these are rock-ribbed Republicans who are now deserting the cause. Elon Musk is not exactly a right-wing person with as good a job as he's been doing with Tesla. So I think you have to put it a little bit in that perspective. I think what's sad is for business leaders to give up an opportunity to influence policy over some singular issue with which they disagree. I don't think that's very well considered.
Right. You mentioned kind of in the context of business having generally good morale about everything that's happening, tax reform. One of the things kind of watching the negotiations play out is that it feels like we're sort of moving from true tax reform, a comprehensive overhaul of the system, getting rid of some of these loopholes and deductions, and to sort of more of a traditional tax cut plan, partly because that's easier to pass, and just that's where negotiations have gone. Is that a correct read, or do you still think it's possible to get kind of true reform in the sense that we saw, like we saw in the 80s?
Well, the true objectives are simplification and reduction in tax burden. Americans spend 6 billion hours per year preparing tax forms. Think how much better the economy would be if that 6 billion hours were put to some sort of productive use. That's a lot of people power being wasted. 94% of Americans find it necessary to use an outside advisor to fill out their tax form. That seems a very wasteful thing. Probably good for the advisors, but for people in general, you really ought to have, for most people who are just W-2 employees, it really should be a one-pager. It shouldn't be multiple pages.
Do you see all those things would obviously be great for the economy? Do you see that happening? Is that still in reach, or are we going to end up kind of with just cutting the corporate rate, maybe some individual deductions?
Well, I hope that there's real reform, but that becomes largely in the hands of the Congress. Mm-hmm. And it's part of the reason the president wanted to accelerate things. Right. These are complicated tasks, sure, and they'll be made even more complicated by some of your neighbors here on K Street as they lobby and lobby and lobby for their favorite little wrinkle.
Right. Yeah. On the corporate number, you talked about making our corporate tax rate competitive. Obviously, we're at 35%, which is way higher than the rest of the developed world. The president wants 15%. Some Republicans on the Hill say 15% is too much, too far. You have been in the corporate world. Do you think it's realistic to get to 15%? And if not, where is a good place to get that would kind of unlock some of this economic growth?
The number you get to is really a function to some degree of the other reforms, and most importantly, how the Congressional Budget Office scores it. Likely this will have to be a thing done by reconciliation. And for reconciliation, you need the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, scoring over a 10-year time period. So the lower the rate, the more of these special things, these gimmicks that you need to do away with.
Yeah. And you think some of that, the big picture overhaul is still a possibility, that it's still?
Well, I think we would be far better off as a country to have a lower base rate and far fewer complications.
Yeah. This week we've seen sort of a new push for bipartisanship. We talked about the big deal.
Right.
Heidi Heitkamp flew with the president to North Dakota for his tax reform event.
Right.
Are you in touch with Democrats on the Hill? Do you think some Democrats might actually get on board with what we're talking about?
Well, I certainly hope so. There's no inherent reason. I mean, who would want to be in favor of high and complicated taxes? Who's going to use that as a winning campaign thing? It escapes me why that would be attractive for someone to run on that basis.
Yeah. Have you been in touch with any of the Democrats on the Hill?
Sure. We talk with everybody.
Let's switch gears to trade. Another huge thing that you're even more intimately involved in. There's a lot of different kind of hot spots on trade. I want to start with NAFTA,
Right.
just because that's closest to home. After the second round of talks wrapped up, it seemed that there were still a lot of unresolved issues, such as expanding the use of U.S.-made materials in automobiles. There are also some disputes over whether steps should be taken to raise salaries for Mexican workers. You came out in support of raising the minimum wage for workers in Mexico. I just kind of checking in on where negotiations stand. Do you feel like the Mexicans and the Canadians are negotiating in good faith? What are the biggest holdups at this point to kind of reconfiguring this?
Well, you have to put it in perspective. There have only been 2 sessions so far, the original one in Washington and then the one in Mexico City that just completed. The next one will be in Ottawa in, I think, 2 weeks or so. In any big complicated negotiation, and this is a complicated one, you've got something like 2,500 pages to deal with. Now, of those 2,500 pages, there are only a handful that are really key, but you've got to wind through all of them. So the strategy in the negotiations was start with some of the easier things, get some of the textual issues out of the way, try to build some momentum so that you really had some momentum, a feeling of togetherness as you move into the harder issues.
And so obviously, I get the point about how it's still early. Do you feel like the other 2 countries are negotiating in good faith and trying to get some momentum and make deals, or are they kind of dragging their feet?
It's too early to really tell. This is a total of 10 days is all of negotiation. That's not a lot. It took them, 8 years to do an average trade treaty, so we're trying to get done more or less by the end of the year, a whole revamp. So this is an unprecedented thing.
Totally.
And so is the pace. Having 5 consecutive days of negotiation and then only recessing for a couple of weeks between, that's unheard of.
Right.
That's a record-breaking pace. Now, that may sound strange to you because it doesn't strike me as a private sector guy as very rapid, but relative to the way things have been done before, it is extremely rapid.
Does your gut tell you we'll be able to get something done by the end of the year, that there will be some agreement? Obviously, these things can end up dragging on and people can...
Well, it can't drag on too long because of the political calendar. You have the Mexican presidential elections in midsummer next year. You have Canadian provincial elections around the same time. Our fast track authority, the Trade Promotion Authority, expires in July of next year. And then obviously in November next year, we have the midterm elections. So as you get closer to all of those political dates, the ability to get anything done will go down.
Right.
So there's no fine line magic date, but more or less around the end of the year is probably where we're going to need to know where we are.
Yeah. And I mean, do you see it as a possibility that NAFTA could kind of fall apart if these negotiations don't work? Is that something that's on the table?
Well, the president has made clear if they don't work, he's going to pull out. Yeah. So that shouldn't be a shock to anyone. And really, that's the right thing. We need fixes to this deal. It has not worked the way that it was intended to. And not to pick particularly on Mexico, but as an illustration, pre-NAFTA, we routinely had $4 to $5 billion a year of trade surplus with Mexico. Now, what do you think the cumulative trade deficit with Mexico has been since NAFTA?
Not that.
$1 trillion.
Wow.
Now, even by Washington standards, $1 trillion, I can barely pronounce it, $1 trillion is a big number.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's just Mexico's fault, that's not the point. But it's a stark contrast to have a trade agreement was supposed to benefit both sides.
Right.
It was also supposed to raise the standard of living in Mexico. And until recently, they haven't had a single increase in their minimum wage in years and years and years and years. And even now, it's what, $1 or $2 a day. It's not very good. So the prosperity has not been very well distributed down there.
Do you feel like NAFTA has been a net plus for the U.S.? Obviously, $1 trillion is a lot of money, even by Washington standards. But have we benefited from it kind of net?
Well, you can argue that anything that makes for more trade is useful, but I don't think that's the point. The point is it an appropriate agreement? Did it fairly distribute the benefits? And we don't think that it did.
Yeah. Let's switch gears to Asia, a country where you have a lot of experience. Back in 2015, before you took office, you received one of the most prestigious awards the Japanese government gives foreigners for helping improve relations for your work and business over there. In Asia right now, there's a very complex interplay between foreign policy, national security, and economic policy and well-being, and I kind of want to unpack that dynamic. We're seeing it pretty clearly right now in North Korea, which we'll talk about in a sec, but China obviously just is the elephant in the room.
Right.
You tried to negotiate a deal with China on steel exports. There were some press reports that you presented the president with a proposed deal this summer under which the Chinese would agree to short-term goals for reducing their steel production capacity. That didn't happen. And now kind of there's talk about leaning more toward imposing tariffs on Chinese steel exports. I know the International Trade Commission is due to make a preliminary decision about whether these steel imports injure U.S. producers, I think on October 2nd, which is 3 weeks from now. What kind of progress has been made on this front? Are new tariffs coming soon? Where do you see this going?
Well, our practice is to announce things once they are official and have been announced. So you'll be the first to hear.
I'll watch your Twitter. I mean, just in general, kind of not specifically when news is coming, but what, I mean, can we expect action soon against the Chinese on some of these things, the dumping, the IP?
It's very complicated because you have the singular problem of Chinese being about 90% of the trade with North Korea.
Right.
So in order to make sanctions really effective, you can't have them being as generous as they have been in terms of trade. So that's one direction of trade policy. Then the other one is our deficit with China, which, depending how you measure it, is more or less $500 billion a year. And what is interesting, China, if you took U.S. out of the equation, China has a net trading deficit with the rest of the world. Their trade surplus with us makes up for that deficit and then leaves them with a net surplus. So in effect, we're absorbing an awful lot of cumulative problems from elsewhere.
Right.
That seems a bit of a heavy burden.
Yeah.
And we're working very hard to try to fix that.
Yeah. On Saturday, there were a lot of media reports that the president's instructed advisors to prepare to withdraw from the free trade agreement with South Korea. The next day, North Korea appeared to test the hydrogen bomb. Obviously, these are, as you say, there's sort of an interplay.
You surely aren't trying to blame the president.
I'm not. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not at all. What I'm trying to point out is that there's this, there's this issue with South Korea that is simultaneously going on. At the same time, North Korea continues to be bellicose and confrontational. There's some concern in the kind of the national security community that messing up our relationship with Seoul when we're trying to counter Pyongyang is a bad idea. I mean, how much is one connected to the other? I'm not saying the North Koreans were reacting.
Well, they're both relevant because they're both very important factors in the relationships among the countries. It's one of the things that makes it very complicated.
Do those kinds of tests make it harder to?
Well, I don't think it's inherent in having someone as an important national defense partner that you also have to run a trade deficit with them.
That's true.
What has happened with Chorus, which is the technical name for our agreement with South Korea, what's happened with it is that our exports to South Korea have not gone up. They actually have arguably gone down a little bit, whereas their exports to us, particularly of automobiles, have gone up a lot. And that's why the trade deficit has gotten so big.
Yeah.
So it's very much bundled into one segment.
Yeah. Sticking in that part of the world, but changing gears, Afghanistan, it hasn't gotten, I mean, the president obviously gave his big speech recently about sending more troops there. You delivered a plan this summer to the president to get the Afghanistan economy back on its feet that relies in part on tapping into the country's estimated $1 trillion in mineral resources, trillion even by Washington standards, as you said, a lot of money. The president has said we can use some of those resources to repay us for what we've spent there. You have a background in mining. You were in the iron ore and coal business. So you also, it's not an easy activity. You said recently it's not exactly clear what mineral deposits they fully have. We have to study that. Obviously, Afghanistan has a big corruption problem. The security environment's not ideal. Where does the plan stand, and are we going to be able to benefit from that?
Well, to give you the background, a few years ago, the U.S. Geological Survey did a survey of Afghanistan. And it was not done on ground level with a lot of borings. It was done mostly from the air. But it concluded that there was about $1 trillion of natural resources, not counting oil and gas, so copper, lithium, minerals of those sort. That's a big number. Yes. And given that Afghanistan is such a small economy, just developing any small portion of that would be transformative for the economy. So we need to refine our thinking, what really is available there, and especially what might be available there in open pit mining, because that's the easiest kind. It's one that would use a lot of indigenous labor, and it's a harder thing for the Taliban or ISIS to interfere with, as opposed to a deep underground mine. So the next phase would be learning more about what's actually there, where is it, how recoverable is it, and then ultimately getting some big international mining firms to come in and do the job.
Yeah. The census, you oversee the census.
Yeah.
It's maybe the most important thing the government does that no one talks about. It's enshrined in the Constitution. In your confirmation hearing, you noted that you may be the first Secretary of Commerce who once was a census taker as part of a project, I think, at Harvard Business School.
It wasn't a project, I was working my way through school.
Wow. Minimum wage, was that?
Well, they paid a little over minimum.
Good. The Post ran an op-ed piece I wanted to ask you about last week by two former Census Bureau directors, one a Republican, one a Democrat. They said planning for the 2020 census is underfunded, that it's behind, that the Bureau lacks political leadership. The former director resigned in June. Where does that stand in terms of getting a former director, and are the resources going to be there to complete a thorough, accurate census?
Well, we're actively searching for a new director. Historically, census directors have tended to be statisticians.
Right.
But given the magnitude of the project, it's one of the biggest rollouts any management will ever have attempted, in that for 2010, we have to hire 500,000 part-time workers, get them mobilized, get them out there, get them to do the chore of knocking on the doors of the people who didn't respond to internet, didn't respond to mail, didn't respond to phone calls. So it's not the world's simplest task. To me, it's a gigantic managerial task. There are plenty of very well qualified people within census who know the mechanics, know the statistical aspects, but it's really a huge management job, and it's a unique one in that it only comes to life every 10 years for the decennial census. So it's got a very peculiar set of management challenges, and it's a huge budget, not trillions, but well into the billions. Now,
but it affects trillions in spending, ultimately.
Oh, it does, because the census is used importantly for three things. One is allocation of congressional seats among the states. Second, it's often used for the redistricting within states. It's one of the components of that. And then the third, it's used for appropriations.
Right.
So it's a very, very important thing. Beyond that, the private sector uses it a lot. Everybody trying to design a marketing program uses census data, trying to figure out the demographics of different neighborhoods so that they can figure out how to moderate their pitch to them. Yeah. So it's a hugely important thing. But imagine the problem of hiring very quickly 500,000 people, finding locations for them around the country, because they can't just operate out of their homes, getting these forms sent in. We're going to be trying to do it electronically this time, as opposed to...
Which is going to be a big change.
Yeah, which is a very, very big change. Back when I did it, it was pen and paper. They had little circles, and you had to fill in the little circle, and kind of a crude way to transmit information. Now it'll be a little more sophisticated, but that's its own issues. We've had to do a lot of systems work, which is still a work in progress, in order to create the mechanism where you can get these huge amounts of input over a very short period of time. So there's a big managerial challenge in the ramp up. There's a big technological challenge with getting the systems all together so that this can be done properly. And then the final thing is coordinating it and implementing it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up soon, but I wanted to kind of end on a bigger picture note. Broadly speaking, you mentioned your corporate background a couple times. What's the adjustment been like into government? You've talked about it in a couple different places. What's been the most surprising thing about being a cabinet secretary versus being a CEO? And I mean, what has that been like?
Well, there have been a couple surprising things. The first is I had to adjust to having a boss again, and I haven't had one in quite a long time, so that was an adjustment process. But the most heartening thing about it is Washington as a place is a very habitable community. I'd spent time here before but never lived here, and it's a wonderful place to live. So that exceeded my expectations by quite a bit. The other thing that exceeded them by quite a bit was the quality of people in the mid-ranks in the government. There are a lot of very, very dedicated people, very skilled people, very knowledgeable people. In some cases, they've been kind of trapped in a dysfunctional system, but if you can liberate them, they can really do good things, and they want to do good things. And that was something that exceeded very much my expectations. I had no idea what it would be like. We have 47,000 employees in our group at Commerce, and it's very disparate things. We're kind of a big conglomerate, because it goes from things like the Weather Service, NOAA, space launching of satellites, managing the fisheries, the ocean fisheries all around the country. It covers a whole range of different activities, and then the whole trade and trade enforcement activities. So it's a very complicated department from that point of view.
Do you think you'll stay the whole term, all 4 years? What's your thinking there?
4 years. President's counting on 8 years.
You like it. You like Washington.
I do. I do.
All right. Well, Secretary Ross, thank you so much for your time. I'd like to thank you again and our audience for joining us this morning. A reminder, thank you. A reminder to everyone that you can find full video and details on upcoming events at WashingtonPostLive.com. Thanks again. Thank you, Secretary.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.